The city of Rome stood on the precipice of great change. It had just appointed a dictator, Manius Valerius Maximus, to deal with the popular discontent which was rife in the city. Manius now held very nearly unchecked power, and it was his decisions that would shape the immediate future of not only Rome and its citizens, but the entire Italian peninsula. The question was, would it be the people of Rome who would feel the benefits of a dictator, or would it be the Senate and the Patricians who would be saved by one of their own? Let's talk about it. Before we get any further into today's episode, I just want to quickly ask that you subscribe and like if you enjoy my content. It really helps the channel out and it motivates me to make more content. Now back to your regularly scheduled programming. I should note here, this is the second part in a two-part series, so if you have not seen part 1, I would definitely recommend it. The link will be in the upper right hand corner as well as in the description. Manius assumed his position as dictator in 494 BCE. Manius was the brother of the extremely popular and well-liked Publius Valerius Poplicola, who had died about a decade earlier. Poplicola had been instrumental in overthrowing the Roman monarchy, and his agnomen, Poplicola, literally meant friend of the people. Manius's first act as dictator was to issue an edict similar to that of Servilius's edict. It essentially forbade imprisonment of any military-age debtor and gave assurances that if the debtor served in the legions, he would not have his property nor his goods seized. This seemingly worked, as 10 legions were raised, the most the Romans had ever raised. The 2 consuls were each given 3 of the legions, while the remaining 4 were commanded by Manius himself. Aulus Verginius, one of the consuls, led his legions against the Volsci, where he not only defeated the Volscian armies, but also annexed the lands and cities of Velatrae, modern-day Velatrae. Titius Veturius, the other consul, led his legions against the Aqui, who had invaded several of Rome's Latin allies. The Aqui simply retreated to the relative safety of the mountains that surrounded Latium. At first, Titus was very hesitant to attack the Aqui while they were held up in the mountains. However, his troops were far too anxious about the ongoing social unrest in Rome to wait, and thus Titus was forced to attack. Apparently, the Aqui were so shocked by this attack that they turned and fled, thus allowing the Romans to win in a bloodless fight. I don't know how true these accounts are, and to be honest, I imagine that there was no fight period, and that Titus simply returned to Rome with his legions behind him, having never fought the Aqui. And lastly, Manius led his troops against the Sabines. We don't know a whole lot about this battle. For instance, we have no idea where it occurred, nor who led the Sabine army. But we are told that the Sabines had spread their infantry too thin, and because of this, their center was vulnerable to a cavalry charge. Luckily, at least for Rome, Manius saw this and ordered a cavalry charge straight through the center line of the Sabines. The Sabines were quickly routed and fled, thus giving Rome another victory. We are told that this battle was so prestigious that Manius not only celebrated a triumph, but was also given a seat for himself and his descendants in the Circus Maximus, from which they would always be front and center to observe any games held. The victory here was so great and important that it was only second to the battle at Lake Regillus, the last battle against Rome's last king, Tarquin the Proud, in terms of prestige and renown. So far, so good for Manius. Upon the return to Rome by Manius, the consuls, and the legions, Manius urged the Senate to act upon the issue of outstanding debt. The Senate, likely still because of the simple fact that they were mostly creditors, refused. Manius was so frustrated by this fact that he refused to remain dictator so long as the Senate refused to act, and thus he resigned. It was said that the people followed him home, applauding the whole way. This is odd. Hypothetically, Manius as dictator had the power to issue whatever decree or edict he wished for the Senate to issue. Perhaps Manius thought that the Senate was better suited to the task, or perhaps he assumed that if the Senate itself did not act, then whatever edict or law he issued would simply be challenged or go unenforced upon him leaving office. Whatever the case, the Senate's attempt to solve the issue with a dictator had just failed dramatically. The Senate was now in utter chaos. They were terrified of further sedition, and terrified that eventually the Roman people would take matters into their own hands. And who knew what a bunch of commoners could do? Makes me shudder to even think about it. Luckily, the Senate knew just what to do to kick the can further down the road. More military service. On the pretext of further raids and attacks by the Aqui, which I think just furthers my theory about there never being a battle with the Aqui, the Senate ordered the legions out of the city. This would have deprived the Roman people of the most active, well-trained, and physically fit protesters. And thus, the prospect of a coup, or some sort of other action, would dramatically lessen. The people were not happy with this. In fact, we are told that they were so unhappy that they seriously contemplated murdering the consuls to get rid of anyone who could command the legions. Eventually, the people decided that a criminal act such as murder could not and would not absolve them of their military oaths, which were considered sacred. One of Rome's leading plebeians, Lucius Sicinius Vellatus, proposed that the people should leave en masse from the city and camp out on the Mons Secur, a sacred mountain some 3-ish miles from Rome. The people apparently listened to Lucius, and together they all marched from the city of Rome to the mountain, where they set up fortifications, including ramparts and several trenches, and waited for several days. Now, does this mean that every plebeian in Rome left the city? I pretty seriously doubt it. Even though Livy makes it seem like every plebeian followed Lucius in his march to the Mons Secur, that would have been a very tall task. At this point, the Roman census records 110,000 people in the entirety of Rome. This includes all citizens, from men to women, and possibly even children. It would only be in the 3rd century BCE that Rome began to count only adult men in their census. If we assume that the patricians made up 5% of that population, which is roughly in line with what later census figures would say, then the patricians only held a population of roughly 5,500 people. That leaves about 104,000 plebeians. I simply cannot believe that 104,000 people would march from Rome to a mountain some 3 miles from Rome and then were able to wait for several days. Logistically, that is next to impossible. Instead, I would imagine a fairly large percent of those 104,000 simply left Rome, or at least did not show up to work the next day. If we assume that, say, 10% of that 104,000 left Rome, then that is over 10,000 people who didn't show up for their daily work. For a bit of perspective, roughly 133 million people currently work in America. 10% of that is over 13 million people. Imagine if 13 million people didn't show up to work tomorrow. It would paralyze the economy. Goods wouldn't be made, transported, or stocked, and all across the country our service economy would completely break down. It would be catastrophic. The same thing happened in Rome. The plebeians didn't need all 104,000 of themselves to not show up to work. That would have been overkill. They could have just as easily paralyzed Rome with 10 or probably even just 5% of their population. Hell, they wouldn't have even had to leave the city, even though we are fairly positive that they did. Simply staying home would have had a similar effect. Anyways, this seemed to have snapped the Senate into action, which is unsurprising when you consider the economic ramifications of your workers simply leaving your city. They sent the former consul, Agrippa Manius Lanitus, to negotiate with the plebeian leaders. Agrippa was not only an extremely great, persuasive, and eloquent speaker, but he was also, at least according to Livy, descended from plebeian blood, and thus was actually quite popular among the plebeians themselves. Livy says that Agrippa told the plebeian leaders a tale about the parts of the human body, and how each has its own purpose in the greater function of the body. The tale goes something like this. The rest of the body thought the stomach was getting a free ride, so the body decided to stop nourishing the stomach. Soon, the other parts of the body became fatigued and unable to function, so they realized that the stomach did serve a purpose, and they were nothing without it. Essentially, he was telling the plebeians that the stomach was the patricians, while the plebeians were the rest of the body. Agrippa eventually convinced the plebeians to send 3 representatives to negotiate some sort of agreement with the Senate. The plebeians sent were Marcus Decius, Spurius Lucilius, and Lucius Junius Brutus, probably related to the same Lucius Junius Brutus who was involved in overthrowing the monarchy, but we're not quite sure. We don't quite know how long these negotiations lasted, just as we don't quite know how long the entire secession lasted. We can assume that it probably wouldn't have been much longer than a few months at most, as the logistics required to supply even 10,000 people for a few months are very complicated, and really require some sort of government, which as far as we know the plebeians had not constituted. But we are told that Rome suffered a famine from these events, so it must have lasted at least long enough for the harvest to go bad. Eventually, the two sides agreed to a solution, which would create a new class of officials, the Tribunes. The most famous of these offices was the Tribune of the Plebs. However, there were actually either 3 or 5 total tribunes at this time, all of which were plebeian. They were indeed led by the Tribune of the Plebs. Eventually this number would be increased to 10 in 457 BCE, where it would remain for the rest of Roman history. The tribunes were designed purely to represent the interests of the plebeians in the Roman government. They were elected by the plebeians alone and were sacrosanct, which meant that to harm one was equivalent to harming one of the gods, and the only punishment was death. The tribune of the plebs had the power to call the plebeian council, or, in Latin, the concilium plebis. Here they could pass laws that only affected the plebeians, elect other tribunes, and even try certain judicial cases. It was almost like its own mini-government inside the larger Roman government. The tribunes also had the power to intervene on the behalf of any Roman citizen to prohibit judgment or actions by other officials or magistrates. This meant that the tribune of the plebs in particular had the ability to veto or prohibit any action taken by the Roman Senate or consuls. The only office exempt from this was the office of Dictator. Additionally, any Roman citizen could ask for the intervention of the tribunes, and the tribunes would be obliged to rule on the legality of whatever action or judgment they were asked to. Eventually, the power of the tribune of the plebs would be even further expanded and would reach its height in the 3rd century BCE, where they could even convene and propose legislation before the Senate itself. However, by the time of Sulla's reforms in 81 BCE, the tribune of the plebs would lose much of its prestige and its power. Lucius Albinus Paterculus, likely the first tribune of the plebs, Gaius Licinius, and Lucius Cineas Vellatus, along with the plebeian envoy Lucius Junius Brutius, were all elected as tribunes shortly after the compromise was reached. Most traditions have the Senate negotiating as one body with the plebeians. However, some say that the Senate sent a group of 10 people to represent the body. This group was either led by Manius Valerius Maximus, the former dictator, or Agrippa Manius Lanitus, the man sent to the plebeians at first. This group of 10 further consisted of Publius Servilius Pruscus Structurus, consul in 495 BCE, Publius Postumius Tubertus, consul in 505 and 503 BCE, Titus Abetius Helvia, consul 499 BCE, Severus Sculpicius Camernius Corntussus, consul in 500 BCE, Aelius Postumius Albus Regilinus, consul in 496 BCE, Aelius Virginius Tricostus Caliomontus, consul in 494 BCE, and Titus Lartius Flavius, consul in 501 and 498 BCE, and a 10th member who remains unknown. A quick disclaimer, I'm pretty sure I pronounced probably all of those incorrectly, but I'm American and I'm from the South, so... Afterwards, as I've already alluded to, it was said that the city of Rome suffered from a severe famine, as the plebeian farmers had not finished their harvest before the secession. Rome was forced to import grain from Etruria, which should give us a good idea of the severity, as Rome hated the Etruscans, and then an even greater amount in the next year from Sicily, the future breadbasket of the Roman Republic and Empire. The first secession of the plebeians marked a turning point in Rome's history. It did not fully transfer power to the plebeians, nor did it fully kick the built-in advantage for patricians out of Rome, but it did give the plebeians some pretty powerful protectors in the form of tribunes, and it showed to the patricians that the plebeians did have some real power, and they knew how to use it. This would not be the last time that the plebeians would use this newly found power. Join me next time when we talk about the second and the third plebeian secession. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you learned something. If you have any further comments or questions on the video, or believe I've made a mistake, please comment down below, and please like and subscribe if you enjoyed. It really helps the channel out. Peace.